Hello everyone, welcome to this Tech Tech. My name is Amit Edgar, or as you can find me online, Ekaros MTG. I'm a Magic the Gathering streamer and aspiring competitive and pro player. And today we're gonna go over one of the, I think, most interesting, fun, and maybe good decks in Standard, Rakdos Midrange. As you can see, the plan is right here, so we're gonna go over Rakdos' plans A and B, the strategy, as we call it, and then over some card choices in the main deck, and then in the sideboard, talk some matchups, and then about the cards that I chose to exclude, because I think these cards tell you a lot about what the deck is trying to do, and where it's actually at in the format right now. So without further ado, let's get to the business. Rakdos Midrange is essentially a Kroxa deck. What does that mean? It means that the plan is to make Kroxa good by grinding resources, trading cards with your opponent 1 for 1, 2 for 1, until both players are really down on resources. But you use Kroxa to utilize the graveyard, which is usually a resource that's not available to you, to take over the game. Now, we know Titans are strong. Uro is banned in Standard, and for a good reason. Uro is really good at pulling you way ahead and giving you inevitability. It wasn't very good at actually killing your opponent. It just did so at some point because you just had so many cards. Kroxa is different. Kroxa is not gonna pull you so far ahead your opponent can't win. Your opponent can still top deck good cards on you when their hand is empty. What Kroxa is good at is closing out the game. So Kroxa, when it attacks and your opponent has no cards in hand, deals 3 damage on triggers, and then they still have to block it. And if they can't, they take 6 more damage. That's 9 damage. Imagine they trade for it and you just escape it again. That's 12 damage in a turn. Kroxa is really good at closing out the game if you set up for it correctly. So this is this deck plan A. You want to set up a board position such that Kroxa can take over the game and then close it really fast. Now that's plan A. Plan B is, when it doesn't work, you just go for beatdowns. You have a bunch of mediocre creatures, and you have a good curve, and you have a lot of spot removals to put your opponent on the back foot. So this usually works on the play, but just going 2-drop into 3-drop into rankle into remove your blocker tends to be enough to put your opponent low enough on life that you can close out the game from there. Now, these are the two plans, and I want to note here specifically that this means that one of the most important things you have to do with this deck is control the board. Now, when I say control the board, I don't mean that you need to kill everything that's on the board. Quite the opposite. You need to make sure that you know what to kill and you know how to leave on the board the threats that don't really threaten you in the short range. So for example, you have Mire Trident, which we're gonna get to soon. Trident has Death Touch, which means a lot of the time if you have a Trident on board, you can ignore multiple big green creatures because opponents are reluctant to attack into the Trident. This gives you time to set up other board positions such as a Liliana or more graveyard cards for Kroxa to eat later, and then you can take advantage of that. On the other hand, if your opponent has an Innkeeper, you probably have to use your Stomp on turn 2 instead of deploying a Trident. So controlling the board is really important, and I think this deck needs to play to the board a lot, just hard casting creatures, making sure the board doesn't get out of hand, because as we said, Kroxa doesn't get you out of tough spots, it finishes the game up. Now, let's talk about card choices and how they help with those two plans. The first cards I want to note are the Mire Trident and the Timuret Calls the Dead. Now, Trident is a 2/1 Death Touch creature that gains you life and mills 2 cards. Timuret Calls the Dead gives you 2 tokens if you hit the correct mills, and gains you life and scries cards. Now, they are both here because Kroxa doesn't just work on its own. Kroxa needs help. 5 cards in the graveyard for escape is not little, and usually escape 3 to 4 times a game. So you need a lot of cards in the graveyard. To enable that, we play these cards. Now, they do one more important thing, as I noted. These cards help you stabilize the board, either by being Death Touch or just 2 creatures. Two 2/2s might seem like not a lot, but they enable some double blocking and some chump blocking even at times, because your goal is to get to set up a position where Kroxa takes over the game, and chump blocking is okay at times. Now, another card that helps enable Kroxa is Magmatic Channeler. But Channeler is different essentially from these other 8 cards. Why is that? Because Channeler, while filling up your graveyard, doesn't really help with your board position. A 1/3 isn't a very good blocker in this format. What it does do is give you more card selection, and it helps you generate more resources. You can capitalize on discarding a card with your escape creatures. So imagine you play the Channeler on turn 2, and then on turn 3, you use it to discard a Kroxa or an Ox, and then you hit a 2-drop or another 3-drop or your land drop for the turn. You just effectively drew a card by putting an escape card in the graveyard. You never wanted to use the front side anyway, like Kroxa's front side is not very good. And you got to play another thing on your turn. This is really, really good and can pull you ahead in a lot of spots. Now, to complement these 11 cards that are basically here to enable this Kroxa plan, we're playing a couple of more cards we're gonna go over. First of all, we have the adventure creatures. Now, we have 7 of them, but I'm gonna refer to them in they have 2 separate roles, so I'm gonna refer to them separately. Bone Crusher is just your general good card. Stomp is really good at hitting annoying small creatures such as Lotus Cobra and Innkeeper and Gilded Goose and Skyclave Operation, just helping you get ahead on board and at the same time giving you card advantage by being both a removal spell and a creature. The body is surprisingly relevant, and when I'm on the play, I'm not beyond just hardcasting this on turn 3 and start attacking, especially if I have a couple of removal spells and a Rankle to back this up. Now, Bone Crusher is just a generally good card. Rider, on the other hand, is mostly a removal spell. The 2/3 lifelink body is not that good in the format, you almost never cast it, and it's really hard to double spell because double black is actually quite a hard restriction. Now, what it does do is kill creatures efficiently and planeswalkers efficiently for 3 mana. What the other thing it does is that it's another creature to fuel Timuret Calls the Dead. You usually want to play Timuret Calls the Dead only when you have creatures in the graveyard to actually make sure that you can get the full value off of it. But sometimes you have to just cast it. And when you do, and you have no graveyard, you need to hit creatures. And this ups the density of creatures in the deck while giving you another good removal spell. Now, it's not that the 2/3 body is bad or anything, but you usually have better things to do, like escaping Kroxa or drawing cards, and we're going to get to that later. Now, these are the adventure creatures. Here we have the package of 6 cards. Liliana, Waker of the Dead, Rankle, Master of Pranks, and Ox of Agnes. Now, Liliana and Rankle are here to help you push your advantage on turn 4. You can't always escape Kroxa on turn 4, it's actually quite rare. It's really difficult to do that unless you have a really, really good draw. These cards also pressure your opponent's hand by using the plus here, or using the first trigger, and they also help stabilize the board. Liliana has a minus ability that kills the creature, and Rankle has the sacrifice ability. And as we said, we have a lot of chaff creatures in the deck. Now, these cards are here to push your advantage forward. They don't usually catch you back up when you're behind, which is why it's important to set up on turns 2 and 3. Liliana also helps you both of them help you get rid of Kroxa in hand when you don't have time to use the front side of it. Ox functions as sort of like Kroxa 5 and 6. It's really important for your game plan that you gain card advantage through the graveyard, because otherwise your cards are kinda meh. So Ox just gives you more density of escape cards, and it's just a good card to hardcast or top deck. Now, Ox's real power comes when you escape it on turn 4 or 5, and then you play another spell on the same turn, which means you effectively used 8 or 7 mana on a really early turn, and drew some cards and affected the board a lot, because Ox comes back as a 5/3, and a 5/3 tossles with most cards in the format. So Ox is a really good card, but it's really hard to escape 2. Escape 8 is a lot of cards, so we're not running more than 2 of these. Now, these give you the core creatures of the deck. Let's move to another important part, which is the removal suit. You may say, look at the list and say, well, you don't have a lot of removals, right? I mean, there's just these 5. But in fact, we have more than 15 removal spells. We have Riders and Stomps here. We have 5 removal spells here. We have the model double face cards, which we're going to get to in a bit. And then we have Liliana and Rankle, which can also remove creatures from play, even though they require more setup. Now, my removal suit is geared toward one specific card, which is called Scavenging Ooze. Scavenging Ooze is nigh unbeatable for this deck if they get to untap with it, and they're at any kind of parity. Even just one activation, taking your Kroxa from the graveyard, can set you back a lot, because you're planning 2-3 turns ahead to try and use this Kroxa to take control of the game, and if it's gone, it's not about the 1 life or the 1 power on the Ooze, it's about the fact that now your plan is non-existent. It's almost like the Thoughtseize is your best card from your hand. So this is why we run 3 Thirst and 1 Eliminate. Despite the fact that Heartless Act usually kills a wider variety of creatures, Heartless Act is very bad at dealing with Scavenging Ooze, and we need to have removals for that Ooze. Do note that we have Murderous Rider, so things are not as bad as they might seem. Other than this, I want my removal spells to have 2 functions, which are to be efficient in the early game and still effective in the late game, which is why I really like the Thirst. In the late game, when your opponent is top decking, usually using 4 mana to trade for their biggest card is good enough for you, and you'll take it. Because cards like Vivian, which are really hard for you to beat, if they generate 1 card, 1 token, it's okay. If they generate more than this, it's going to be really tough. So you have to have a lot of removal spells that are good both early and late. Now let's get to the mana base, because I think this is my biggest innovation in the deck, and I think it's the most important part to make it better. So most lists I've seen run somewhere between 7 to 8 model double face cards. Now, model double face cards, which are spells that can be played as lands, are really strong. Don't get me wrong, I'm with you. But they come with a real cost. As I mentioned before, your deck needs to set up very well in the early game so it can control the long game. Now, you already run a lot of come into play tap lands, so playing 4 or 5 more instead of basics is not very good, especially when those cards are very, very inefficient. I don't want to play more than 1 4-mana removal spell that doesn't hit Planeswalkers in a game. Hagra Mauling is not nearly as efficient as Rider or a kicked Bloodchief First, which could be cast for 1 if you need to. And Spikefield Hazard, well, the format has kind of moved from that. It used to be good in the beginning of the format, where you had to hit more Skyclave Shades and opponents were running red 1-drops. Now it's less effective. And Shadow Skull Smashing, while being a good card, is very, very mana intensive. And if you have to take 6 damage in a game to get your lands to come into play untapped, you're gonna fall behind. And this is a problem for this deck, because it doesn't play very well from behind. So I'm cutting down on model double face cards. What do we get in exchange? First of all, we get to run 11 basics, which is very good. Basics are good. We just need the mana to work so we can activate our plan. Now we play Fabled Passage because they full the Kroxa. And then this is the interesting part. I'm splitting 4 Triumphs, 1 Temple instead of the other way around, and the real reason is Castle Locthwain. Now, before we get to the castle, I do believe Triumphs have the potential to be better than Temples, because you can use them to put cards in the graveyard, and every card in the graveyard matters for your escape cards. But I also think that they enable Castle, which is really good. Castle is probably one of the best black cards in this format. It's basically Phyrexian Arena in the late game, especially in your deck, which usually has no cards in hand in the late game. So if you think of Castle Locthwain as model double face card, because I'll take a Phyrexian Arena over a Spikefield Hazard every day, that also can come into play untapped and makes your mana base better, I think this exchange is really, really good for you, and I would recommend using my mana base, which I think is very strong. Now, we have talked about the main deck, so we're gonna run over some sideboard cards and then talk matchups. Now, you can note that we have 26 cards in the sideboard. That's unusual. Two reasons for that. We have 6 more cards we're going to address a bit later. And these 20 cards are, I think, your best options for the sideboard, but you need to adapt them for the metagame. So let me give you an example. You can see here we have 6 big threats. Now let's take the biggest one, Tower of the Pix. Tower of the Pix is really good in one kind of matchups, which is various green, black, and white mid-range decks, usually involving adventures, but not always, but not the ones that have Yorion. Why is this good in that matchup? Because sometimes you need an extra top end that if you get to untap with it, just closes out the game. They can flood the board really, really well, and you need a flying threat, and also Terror has a really good synergy with Kroxa and with Ox. So I think Terror is good in that matchup. But if you don't expect to see it during a tournament, like I'm not expecting to see a lot of green decks, at least not fair green decks in the sense that they're not playing Yorion, in this Awaken's Mana Trader series, then I'm not going to play the Terror. So you need to figure out what's the metagame going to look like and then trim the 5 sideboard cards that you don't need. So let's go over these briefly. We mentioned Terror already. Skyclave Shade and Phoenix of the Ash do 2 things for you. First of all, they let you transition to becoming more aggressive in matchups where that's needed. For example, in the Yorion matchups, you can't play the late game. They're just going to go over the top of you. So instead you have to be aggressive, and these cards give you that option. Also, they help you play around Graveyard Hate. Why is that? Because they require a lot less resources in the graveyard to utilize. Phoenix only escapes by exiling 3 other cards. Shade just needs you to play a land and you can cast it from the graveyard. So they put your opponent in the squeeze of, do I pop my lantern right now? So they can't get this, but they don't have a lot of cards, or do I wait for their graveyard to be bigger and nab a Kroxa? This puts them in spots where you can put them in a tight spot, and they have to make tough choices, which is good for you. This is what this deck is about. Now, I also think Phoenix specifically is especially good right now because with Ox, it's probably the second best red card versus rogues. Just the fact that it's a 3/3 flyer when you escape it, and it only costs 4 to escape, unlike stuff like Polucranus, which costs 6, is really important. It blocks everything that they have. Really strong card. I like it a lot. Now we get to actually these 5 cards, which are your Graveyard Hate. Now, I do believe Soul Guide Lantern is better than Cling to Dust, especially for the mirror where these cards really matter. Lantern just stops your opponent from doing something really strong, like Kroxa or Ox. Additionally, if they play a Shade and you can kill it and use the ETB on Lantern to exile the Shade, it puts you really far ahead because you've basically eliminated a lot of their resources using 1 card. Cling is nice because it replaces itself in the early game if you need to, and it has Escape to give you more gas in the late game. I dislike it though, because we already have 6 other escape cards, 8 if you count the Phoenixes, and while it's very good versus rogues, all of your other cards are so good versus them, Cling is not necessary. So I tend to cut them from the sideboard. Now, let's talk about some removal spells. We have 2 more removal spells here. Choose your removal spells wisely. It really depends on the format. If you think you'll see a lot of Scavenging Ooze, play Eliminate over Heart-Attack. If you think you'll see a lot of Blue-White Yorion, maybe you just want a Heart-Attack because you need an instant speed answer to Yorion and to Skyclave Shade. Skyclave Apparition, my bad. And Shredded Sails is an interesting card. I have not made up my mind if I like this card in the sideboard or not. It feels necessary at times because, as I mentioned before, you can almost never beat the Great Henge. If this card resolves and they get to untap with it, you usually lose the game. Shredded Sails is an answer to this that also randomly kills flyers, like Rankle in the Mirror, or it kills Stone Cold Serpent 2, or it kills Vantress Gargoyle, or the 1/3 Rogue, the Soaring Thought Thief. And it has cycling, so the floor on it is never too low, but I am not sure if I actually want to sideboard this in versus the green decks. So this card is always, I tend to play 1, but I'm not sure this is the correct thing to do, and maybe you should try and do some testing and see how it feels for you. I think You could conceivably replace the Shredded Sails with their Remorse and try to stop their Great Henge in hand, or you can just play 1 to have an out, or you can play 2 and try to set up a game where they can't win unless they resolve the henge, and once they do, you just kill it and gain a lot of tempo advantage. Now, this brings me to my last 5 cards. Agonizing Remorse, 3 of them, and Inscription of Ruin. Inscription is basically a mind rot here. I almost never want to use the other modes, but the fact that it has the kicker and the other modes available make this much stronger than a mind rot. These cards are really important to fight versus decks trying to go over the top of you, because playing to the board doesn't matter. They're just going to go over the top of your board. So you have to grind out their resources before they can do too powerful things, and then you can win the game with whatever's left. This is what this deck does. This basically is saying there are matchups where Bloodshed Spheres doesn't do anything, and we need better cards. Now, if we're at that part already, let's go and talk about the matchups. I'm going to start with Rogues. Rogues is by far your best matchup. It's ridiculously good for you. And it's ridiculously good for 2 reasons. One is that you have really efficient removal spells. Rogues isn't very good if they don't get momentum going. And you can easily stop this momentum. I mean, just imagine trading a Trident for their Thieves Guild Enforcer. This is a really good exchange for you, or just using 1 Bloodshed Spheres to stop a Crab or a Soaring Thought Thief. Now, the second reason is that all the hard work that they're doing to fill up your graveyard, to resolve their card into the story, which is the way they take control of the game, you can undo it easily with Kroxa and Ox. And once you escape and empty your graveyard, 2 things happen. First of all of their cards become worse, drown in the lock, into the story, and all their creatures, they have pump abilities based on the size of your yard. This is the first thing. The second thing is that your opponent is gonna be down on cards for sure. Either you resolve a Kroxa or an Ox, you got a body on board, you got a trigger from both of these, and now they still have to answer it, because each of these cards easily raises Rogues on its own. Or they answer it, and then they're still down a card because you just milled your card to the graveyard, and then you cast it from there. So you still have all the gas you had before, and they have less cards in hand. So Rogues is a really good matchup. Just don't let them get going, and play to the board, and escape as much as possible to keep your graveyard count low. Do know that you need to close out the game, because they can mill you out, for sure. So be careful of that. The second matchup I want to talk about is Adventures. When I say Adventures, I mean mostly the Golgari version, but you can find Selesnya and Abzan versions as well. Against these decks, it's a mid-range battle, right? The thing is that you have to stop their Innkeeper. This is the first engine that they can get running, and this engine can bury you. Why can it bury you? Because their cards line up, their adventure creatures line up very well against yours. Falmar Knight and Lovestruck Beast specifically are really big problems because just one of these stops almost all of your attackers. So Bonecrusher can't really attack profitably into any of these. Trident embarrassing versus Heart's Desire, and Timurd Calls the Dead tokens just get bricked really early by like Murderous Rider or something. So you have to stop the Innkeeper, because if these cards give them more advantage, then not only you're not going to control the board, they're going to have a full hand to discard bad cards to Kroxa and keep the strong cards. Now, their second engine, as we mentioned before, tends to be the Great Henge. So you can beat the Great Henge if it's coming late and you have an advantage on the board. But this means that you have to emphasize in the early game to stop their big green creatures. This usually means killing Polucranus, Kazan the Mammoth, and Lovestruck Beast on sight. Not because they pressure your life, like you can have a Trident in play, that's okay. But because they're gonna enable a really, really cheap Great Henge, and you just can't handle that. Now, once you gain board advantage in the early game, you can start pressuring them. Kroxa is really strong versus them. They don't really have a way to handle it easily in the pre-board games, and not efficiently after board as well. And controlling the board allows you to stop their less frightening card, which is Vivian. Vivian is a really strong card, and if it gets going, you're probably gonna get buried. So having board advantage to kill Vivian, or just keeping the last Murderous Rider to kill their Vivian, is really important. I think this matchup is Good for you. It's not nearly as good as Rogues. It's not one-sided. It has a lot of play to it, and it's actually very interesting. And I do enjoy it a lot. The next match I'm going to talk about is aggressive decks, and by this I mean mono green, mono red, and Gruul. Now these matchups are interesting because your game plan is very, very specific. They tend to not have ways to handle a Kroxa on board, not efficiently at least. And they have a hard time stopping it from the graveyard, except for Scavenging Ooze, which we touched about. So your plan here is to kill the first couple of creatures, and then attack their hand a bit to set up a turn where you can escape Kroxa, and it both takes the last card out of her hand, and it stops all of their good attacks. So it's the biggest thing on the board. Or at least equal to the biggest thing on the board. Now, that's tough. You're gonna have to take damage to do that a lot of the times. But you have to do it this way and then start pressuring with Kroxa, because all of these decks actually have inevitability over you. They have Embercleave, they have the Great Henge, they have Primal Might, they have Vivian, they have all sorts of troublesome cards for you. So once you take over the board, you can't just let them draw forever. They can just bury you out. They can Embercleave you, and you have no removal spells because you don't have infinite cards. So Kroxa needs to start attacking. It's a really intricate matchup, and it really depends on the draws, on how the games play out, on how you sequence your removals and your opponent sequences their creatures. So I do think you're favorable in these matchups generally, but their decks are strong enough to go either way. Be sure to play carefully and set up that Kroxa. Now, the next two matchups, I'm going to talk about one more matchup before hitting the mirror, and that matchup is Yorion decks, and this matchup is very bad. I'm sorry to tell you, it's really hard to defeat Yorion decks. The reason being that just removing their creatures from play isn't good enough. They're just gonna bury you over with a bunch of enchantments and flickering them with Yorion. So the way to fight these matchups is exactly these discard cards. You need to attack their hands aggressively, even ignoring the board to an extent, but making sure it doesn't get out of hand. Now, if you can make sure that they have only one or two enchantments in play, and they don't have Skyclave Apparitions in play, and they don't have targets for Elspeth Conquerstaff in the graveyard, then you can even beat a couple of Yorions, because you can grind them out. You have a lot of card advantage. You have Kroxa and you have Ox, and then you have some Planeswalkers, and you can get more cards from the sideboard. So it's all about making sure they don't snowball really fast, because if you snowball and they snowball, they're just gonna win. So you have to stop them from doing their thing, and then applying pressure and closing out the game. Now, I want to talk about the mirror for a second. The mirror is really interesting because it's a lot about who's the beatdown. So look at Skyclave Shade. This is the card that comes in the middle. And Shade is really strong on the play, but is kind of mediocre on the draw. Or if one player has Shade and the other doesn't, then that immediately almost puts them in that aggressive role. Because this deck doesn't break big creatures very well, or flying creatures, and we have a lot of removal spells. So one player needs to identify that they're the aggressive deck and try to put pressure on the board. The other player needs to understand that they're the control deck and try to stop the pressure and try to win in other ways. Matchup is really, really interesting. It's really intricate. It's a lot about positioning and whether you actually want to use the Kroxa, because they might discard their own Kroxa, and when do you play the Lantern and when do you crack it. Really intricate, really interesting. A lot about trades, card advantage, and board position. Really fun matchup. Unlike other mirror matchups like Yorion, I think. So we talked about the sideboard cards. We talked about the matchups. Now we're going to talk about a couple of cards that I dislike in this kind of strategy. We're going to do it this way. The first of these is Agnes Awakening. Now, I told you what I think about model double-faced cards, and I don't think Awakening is a bad card, don't get me wrong. But take a look at the creatures we have. If you're not casting Awakening for 4, it's just too low impact, and Awakening for 7 is, like, spending 7 mana to cast this with X equals 4 is so hard in this deck, because you usually don't end up having more than 5 to 6 lands in play. So Awakening, I think, is not good enough for this for this archetype. I do believe Castle is just the better version of it. You could probably run one instead of a swamp, but I really dislike it. I wouldn't recommend it. Second card is Nighthawk Scavenger. Scavenger is a card that looks cool. It looks like it does a lot of things. It's a flyer, it has lifelink, it has death touch, but it runs into two problems. The first of them is that it's usually just not as impressive, as big, as impactful as you'd like. Sometimes you need to leave it on defense, and it's just a glorified Mire Trident, but it didn't mill you cards. Sometimes it's only a 2-3, so attacking for 2 in the air while your opponent is bashing you on the ground is not very good. The second problem is that Scavenger doesn't give you immediate advantage upon entering or upon casting or upon dying, unlike every other card in your deck. So look at the cards we have here. We have ETB Trigger, we have ETB, we have ETB, we have Adventures, ETB, and Haste. The one standout here is the Channeler, but the Channeler is really good early, and to be honest, usually quite okay with trading them like in the early game, and it's only 2 mana, which matters a lot for this deck because you want to double spell from turns like 4 or 5 a lot. Scavenger is just underwhelming, and I wouldn't recommend playing it. I think you have better options, for example, Phoenix of Ash, and I don't think it's much better than the Trident in every other matchup, so I would recommend against it. Now, Ember of Shieldbreaker, I mean, I'm only gonna touch on this briefly. I just keep seeing one of these pop in the lists from the days of Adventures with Clover, and that's irrelevant anymore. That's irrelevant now. Shredded Sails just is better than this on every metric, except for being a creature for Timber it costs that. But this one cycles, it's an instant speed, it has other applications. Here the body is irrelevant. Battle Display is a sorcery, which matters a lot. I just don't think you should play this card. Just play more Sails if you need to. So the fourth Channeler, I think I touched on this before, but generally you almost never want to play the second one. They almost never get pumped, and you can almost never activate both of them in the same turn because you just don't have the mana and the cards in hand to take advantage of that, so I don't like running the fourth. Extinction Event used to be run for the green matchups, where they usually had a bunch of 1-drops and a bunch of 3-drops, and you can just name odd and get their board. This doesn't really happen anymore. They have Scavenging Goose, they have Gemraiser, they have Questing Beast, they have Stonecold Serpent. So naming even is usually catastrophical for you because all of your good cards like Mire Trident, like the cards that stabilize, so Trident, Croxa, Rankle, tokens from Timber Calls the Dead are all even, and you can't afford to almost ever name even, especially when this exiles, which is really bad for you. So I don't think Extinction Event has any more space in the sideboard. Last card is Duress. Duress is more efficient than Remorse. The exile on Remorse rarely matters. But Duress doesn't hit Yorion, it doesn't hit Skyclave Operation, it doesn't hit Terror of the Peaks, it doesn't hit Polucranus. So Duress just misses on a lot of cards that I actually want to hit in the matchups that I bring it in. So I don't think it's good enough for the sideboard. Now, these are my thoughts on the deck. I probably wouldn't recommend it for this weekend because Yorion decks are very popular, but this deck can definitely come back on the top, and I think if you play enough discard spells and sideboard in the Graveyard Hate versus the Yorion decks, you can also get that matchup to be quite reasonable. And besides that, I think the deck is really cool. I love it. It does some powerful stuff, and it has some really good matchups in the metagame, so once it shifts, you should probably try it out. Thank you all for watching this video, joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this content, please subscribe to the channel. Go check out my Twitch and my Twitter and my Discord. They're all down there in the comments. I was Amit, Echoros MTG. I hope you have all a great day, and thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.